Muchas gracias. Buenos días a todos. I'm very happy to be here. As Nanshu knows, this was a challenge for me. She kept thinking I wasn't going to make it. But if you know me, you know that I am stubborn to the end. And even though my husband thought I was crazy coming all the way from New York City at my age, I thought I really have to be there. I think that one of the things that makes it very attractive for me is precisely the number of scholars from the Asia Pacific that are participating today. I live a very provincial life, even though I've lived in New York City, and it's important for me to be with all of you, to learn from all of you. So thank you very much for having me. I've had a wonderful day or so, not so much a good night last night. I'm still a little jet lagged, but Ingrid Pillar picked me up, and with Ingrid Gogolin, we did Chatswood, and I thank Ingrid for that. And I've also had the opportunity to visit the harbor. So I've done well already. And yes, and I want to acknowledge that I'm a guest in the Darug land, and that I'm looking forward to your work on Wednesday on indigenous languages. So I bring today to you maybe a little bit of myself. It's the type of talk you give when you're my age at the end of a career, and that you can look back and think of what are the things that have in some way affected you. And the message that I have for you today is that sometimes as researchers, we are really not fully seeing the lives of the languaging and the languaging of multilingual people, because the theoretical frameworks that we continue to use do not fit their lives. And I think that's the message that I want to give today to young researchers who are still working their way through all of this. And so I'm going to start with myself. It's sort of, you know, I speak from a position of humility, but also privilege. But also, I think sometimes we have to theorize from the flesh, as Gloria Anzaldúa taught me to say a long time ago. And that's what I'm going to try to do by revealing a little bit of myself to all of you, which is something I usually don't do. Then I want to talk about the mechanisms that we have used in the academy to restrict the vision of multilinguals. Finally, talking a little bit about how to translanguage research and what the tools that we have at our disposal to do so. And then a little bit, because I know some of you are interested on what to do then with education. Okay. No, that's not it. Okay, here we go. So this is something that I wrote recently, and it was about myself. And I called it Unblocking Tapones. Tapones are plugs that you put in yourself, right? To not let things out. But actually, I have found my pleasant places through unblocking them. So I want to tell you a little bit about myself and how I've gotten here. I came from Cuba at the age of 11 to New York City. And as a student, when I was 11, the first words I understood in English was when my bilingual friend said, said to the teacher, don't worry about her, she's just a stupid Cuban girl. And I think since then, I have made it my business to make sure that every child that does not understand the dominant language is not called stupid or inadequate. I then went to school, and of course, back then, with the old days, we still tracked students. And so I was put in the remedial track, in the track where English education meant just doing exercises. When we read literature, English literature, but yet we were never asked to think about what the characters were thinking or feeling. We were just asked facts. Who are the characters? Where do they live? When do they do this? Very limiting education I had. And then I went to college and I took my first Spanish language course. And the professor was a Spaniard, Professor Bonilla, I'll never forget her, who always used to tell me, así no se dice, that's not the way you say it. And I used to say, how could that be? That's the way my mother says it all the time at home, right? So all of these things, language never fit my life, right? Then I went on to be a teacher, and I was supposed to teach in English only, and yet my students were all Puerto Rican at that time. They only spoke Spanish, but I was not allowed to speak Spanish with them to communicate. Didn't make sense. Then I started trying to think about who I was as a Latina in New York, as a Cuban, when there were no relations between the two countries at all, not allowed to go back. And I had to go study Latin American literature. But again, Latin American literature and scholarship was not about me, because it was about a people, a place, a language. It was not about my bilingual life. And then, of course, I then started studying about theories of bilingualism and bilingual education. And I had the pleasure of being the student. Yes, that was me a long, long time ago. It's for you to understand how far this is. I was a student of Joshua Fishman, who was the best mentor a person could have. I always say that everything I know about language, I learned from Fishman 101. But all the theories that I learned then about bilingualism did not fit my life. So I was very grateful for Uriel Weinreich and Einat Haugen's work on bilingualism. You know, back then, very few scholars focused on bilingualism. But I realized that all they were talking about was the contact between languages and the interferences in language, right? So yes, of course, I learned about loans, calques, code switching. I used all that in my own work, but there was something that didn't fit, right? And then, of course, I learned all about language policy and planning. Remember that this was the time after many of the Asian and African countries were getting independence, but the models that we were using to plan language were really models that were drawn from monolingual models. They did not acknowledge the linguistic diversity in those countries. Then we talked about, this was big with Fishman, language maintenance and language shift. But I thought my language is neither being maintained nor shifting. My language is a complete by men, right? A going with the flow of my life. And my life sometimes went one way and sometimes another way. Didn't quite fit. Then we talked about second language acquisition, but there was nothing second about my English. In other words, chronologically, and this was, and I want to just make a parenthesis here, because I'm going to draw from all scholarship by Tobes Kudnapkangas, who just passed away. And I think we have to acknowledge the work that she has done on linguistic human rights. But Tobe, a long time ago, said it doesn't make sense because there are different criteria by which to say that something is second. I could tell you that English was my second language. It isn't the language that I speak, that people identify me with. So it isn't the language that I speak more depending on where I am. So this is all, again, it's a concept that comes from monolingual thinking without realizing that bilingual lives are a lot more complex. The same thing with additive bilingualism. Yes, L1 plus L2, but there was in my life no L1, no L2, and nothing that was being added. It was just a continuum of things. And then, of course, the big concept of diglossia, right? Fishman and Ferguson really thought about this, but I thought this doesn't make sense again in my life because my languages are not compartmentalized in any kind of way. There's no functional compartmentalization. There's no spatial territorial compartmentalization. So it didn't fit my life. Yet these were the concepts that I worked with. And yet these are the concepts that are still being worked with, right? And I want to say that I was very fortunate that Fishman was a generous mentor who always, even though he pushed me to do quantitative research that I learned and then I dropped because it didn't make any sense for me, because I always knew how to do poetry, and I used to get variables together and find very different results. So I knew that this was something that was beyond the science, quote unquote. But he also taught me that he really needed also poets and artists and mystics and philosophers, which I think is something that I do. And especially he taught me to find the voice from within. And this can only be found within, right? We have to look inward and find this voice. And I'm going to come back to it, but I just wanted you to listen. Sometimes it's important just to listen. And then I've spent most of my career working on bilingual education, something that has become very, very different in the United States from the time in which communities struggled for bilingual education because they wanted to make sure that their children were being educated with their songs, their language, their philosophies, their values, right? But as it became professionalized and the government took over, it became something else. And now we talk about dual language, and please don't repeat that term, dual language bilingual education. And again, it doesn't fit the lives of most bilinguals because you are doing English only on one side and the other language only on the other side, and never the two meet. And this is, again, just the third example, the last one I'm going to tell you, about someone else that I've written a lot about, whose life doesn't fit this model, right? This is Julia. She's a 10-year-old Garifuna. The Garifunas were people who came from St. Vincent. They spoke an Arawak language, they're bilingual. And Julia is from Puerto Cortes, a port town in Honduras. When she comes into school, the teacher thinks of Julia simply as a Black immigrant, a speaker of Spanish, abandoned by the mother because she had grown up with her grandmother, from a very poor fishing community, a limited English learner, very timid, and she needs dual language. That's what she needs. Of course, if you're thinking about Julia, if you understand who Julia is, you realize that this dual language model doesn't fit her life. First of all, she also speaks Garifuna. The teacher doesn't even know what Garifuna is, does not recognize it. She only recognizes the more dominant minoritized language, which is Spanish. She has had a loving grandmother. She has grown up in a beautiful setting. Grandmother used to take her fishing every day. She knows a lot about fishing. She also is a very expert composer and player of what's called punta music. It's Garifuna music with drums, etc. She is very, very talented. She declaims poetry. It turns out in many Latin American countries, declaiming classical poetry is something that is done, and there are contests. She has won many contests of declaiming poetry. Now, she crossed the border after Biden's election. And what is interesting about Julia is that wasn't working. Is it working now? Better now? I'm sorry, you should have told me. Okay. So she was smart enough to tell immigration officials, I came alone. And my mother lives in New York City, and this is her number. So a lot going on for this kid. And what she really needs is she needs to be given freedom. She needs to be given the freedom that we give all children that we value to do what she needs to do linguistically so that she can fit in and she can have a life. So keep putting my finger in the wrong side. Here we go. So what I want to tell you, the story that I want, the message that I want you to get is, I don't know if you remember O.J. Simpson's trial. There was a lawyer who said, if the gloves don't fit, you must acquit. And I say to you, if the stories do not fit, if the shoes don't fit, you really must acquit these learners, and you must quit thinking of some things that I think are foundational to what we do. I think you have to quit understanding that two languages are just separate, discrete mental entities, right? When that child that we saw the video clip says, es un reading book para estudiantes que write. When my cousin tells her children all the time, get down from the car. When my Chinese friends whom I do Tai Chi with in the morning tell me, we're not doing Tai Chi, the weather is raining, right? You need the concept of named language to render these speakers deficient, right? The deficiency is not in the speaker. And I think that's the message that I want to get across today, because all these speakers have phonemes, have inflectional forms, have constructional schemas. The deficiency is not in the speaker. The deficiency has been socially determined, because a language is, and I want to stop here and tell you clearly, it's a real social construction. That is, I've been told many times, and I've been called on this, I'm not saying that languages do not exist. Languages exist, and as Macquarie and Pennycook told us a long time ago, they have huge material consequences and real consequences. Languages exist as for identity purposes, but they are social constructions. We have constructed them as such. And so the deficiency is socially determined. The deficiency that we say that happens when someone says the weather is raining, that deficiency is not in the speaker, is in the way that we have defined the concept of what a named language is. So you must quit seeing the language as a single named entity. And you must start really looking and seeing at people doing language with their own unitary repertoire as they assemble or orchestrate a network of this linguistic, semiotic, multimodal features with which we all make meaning with our own lives, with our own knowledge systems and our own epistemologies. I want you to understand that all of us do this. The problem is that we do not give some people the freedom to do that. And I think the question always is, why is it that some of us have the privilege of doing all of this and others do not? So what I want to recognize is this, what we're calling translanguaging as a unitary repertoire. And I think this is what's important. What's important is to make sure that we quit stripping racialized multilingual speakers of the freedom to translanguage, and then thinking that when they do, they're somehow deficient, right? So what are the mechanisms of restriction that we have used? One is, of course, the idea that there's this epistemic superiority and hegemonic modes of thinking and languaging, all having to do with colonialism and what Aníbal Quijano, the Peruvian sociologist, calls coloniality, what was left behind after the colonizers left. This idea that there's some people that were beings and some who were non-beings. This idea that there has been an abyssal line, a line drawn between the global north and the global south, and that there is a gap that we do not see, we don't take a look. The idea that all the readings are from the center, the United States being very, what do you say, responsible for all of this. I think an important point is what Santiago Castro Gomez, another decolonial Latin American theorist, calls the hubris of 0 point. the idea that there is one God's eye point of view, which is white, male, heteronormative, and that is seen as universal, as anonymous, as generalizable, as ahistoric, as objective, and natural, as all-seeing. And the second mechanism is, what Bonilla, Silva, and Suberi calls the epistemic racism and white logic. That is the dehumanization in the colonial encounters, which productively extended from race to include language and also include gender. And the interpretation through racial linguistic ideologies that always represent the languaging of those considered others as being emitted by visibly racialized inferior subjects. Now, I want to say that we are complicit in all of this, right? And I think that's what I want to call your attention to. I think that it comes as no surprise to any of us that the scholarship, including mine, by the way, comes mostly from the global north and in English only, right? And it's gotten worse with automatization because citation indexes, of course, index these works higher than others. And I'm tired of journals telling me that the journal article that got the most clicks is the best one, because of course it doesn't represent the best one. It represents the one that has the most readers because it's a larger context, usually the United States, by the way. And then there's these research traditions of what we do with very linear writing, right? Introduction, methods, results, and discussion, with a review of the literature that's getting narrower and narrower because it doesn't let us look forward. It only lets us look backwards, and coding and data analysis that has to be always justified as someone else did it, rather than thinking that we are smart enough to come up with our own coding and our own data analysis. And then finding patterns when we know that it's usually the exception to the rule that has a lot of truth to it, right? So the research that only finds patterns leaves out all these other people that we see as other. And then this division between mainstream research and indigenous research. I mean, 25 years ago, almost 25 years ago, Linda Tuhiawai Smith came out with her indigenous methodology. And we have all used it, but it has not impacted what we do as other researchers, mainstream researchers, so that we learn from them, but do not keep them separate as something that is done somewhere else. I also think that it's my turn now to tell you some of the microaggressions that I have felt from the academy. So because sometimes young people do not realize that these are coming if you do something different, right? So these are just 3 examples of the probably 3,000 that I have, or 300 that I have, right? I mean, I had a reviewer just recently who told me that racial differences and coloniality is relevant in the United States, but not in other places, right? That is subjective rubbish. And that it's an uneasy blend of social science and creative nonfiction memoir, right? It's interesting that when we speak from a different perspective, it's a memoir, it's nonfiction, right? And then readers. I mean, with social media, I'm sure it's happening to some of you. It's getting worse and worse, right? So just recently, you are a radicalized American educator, inciting hatred, etc. I won't even read the rest because it doesn't make sense. But what I want to point out is that they don't leave it at that. They then talk about the grammatical mistakes. No proper degree of grammatical rules whatsoever is sloppy, right? And you know, I can take this because of who I am and the experience that I have. But I think of poor young researchers who get these readings of their work, and how do you step out of the line? Isn't it easier just to comply to what everybody's saying? Or isn't it appropriate and important to see differently? I want you to also understand that the attacks are not just coming from white majority males. They're also coming from inside. I didn't copy the rest of the quote because it was so offensive, but it started with telling me, eres una malinche. And you probably don't know who the Malinche was, but La Malinche was the Nahua woman who was the translator for Hernan Cortés, and became also his lover. And the Aztec people always have said that she did them in, right? So it's also an attack from within, not only from without. We have to have a hard skin. And I'm, again, giving you these experiences because I've been around for a long time, and you're going to be around for a long time, and you're the future. So it's just a matter of understanding this. So how do you translanguage research? I think that for me, the scholar who started really saying this very clearly was one of your own, Phoenix Lobu, from South Africa, Zimbabwe, and now in Australia for a long time, who has this wonderful article of an encounter with a 7-year-old with whom he plays soccer in Johannesburg, and where he relates in this conversational way this whole exchange of what was happening when he actually left a conference that was supposed to be on translanguaging because he figured that what they were saying was not translanguaging, right? So, and he has this quote, which I think is important, that we cannot understand the world if we continue to use research methods that really arose out of a colonial metropolitan reading of the world. He says, if we recognize that the phenomenology of language is so complex, why is it that we still research using the same conventional methods that are used to investigate languages as ordered and enumerable objects? And then he also calls to question translanguaging research, where he says that the theoretical suppositions are supported by data generated through conventional research methods. So what he's warning us about is the fact that there also has to be a change in the way, not only in the way we think, but also then in our approaches to how we study these phenomena. And Jerry Won Lee has recently come up with an issue of research methods in applied linguistics, where he talks about how to translanguage research methodologies. And he explains to us that one of the problems with translanguaging is that some of people are using the same epistemological paradigms or research questions that are more appropriate for the study of code switching. And I really have to warn you about this, because you know that I have done a lot of work on translanguaging, but I do think that people are using translanguaging in ways that do not advance anything, and we have to be careful. And I want to point out, for example, the coining of the term multilingual translanguaging, which again leaves all the terms intact, nothing changes, right? Multilingual translanguaging. And I think we have to be careful when researchers and scholars pick up terms and then use them in ways that really just reinforce old concepts. And this is Li Wei also, who says translanguaging research requires new analytical methods that move the focus away from treating languages as discrete and complete systems to how language users orchestrate, right? And he has proposed actually 2 ways of doing that. One is what he calls moment analysis. What have you seen then, impromptu, unplanned? That's where it happens, right? If you have to get IRB, then it's more a problem. And what he calls LLTT, which is basically just look closely, listen, talk to others, and think. It's simple. You know, this is not brain surgery. It's simple. It's just a matter of taking on another role. What is the translanguaging researcher's role? We have to give up what Walter Mignolo calls the locus of enunciation, this dominant way of looking always, and making sure that we realize that our task as researchers is to light up the darkness and envision with eyes wide open and repair el daño. I'm glad you're in a health faculty here, Nan, because I think this is a lot about healing. How do you then heal? And you do it sin miedo, without fear. I think it takes courage. It's taken me a long time to sort of say, well, this is bullshit. It doesn't fit my life. It doesn't fit the lives of most of the people that I work with. But it takes courage because you're stepping out of the conventions, right? And I'm quoting here Robin Kelly, an African-American historian, who says that freeing our imaginations from the slavery to preconceived notions may be the most difficult struggle we have ever faced. And it takes complicated intellectual work, and complicated intellectual work that also requires some dreaming and some imagining. So what are some tools to translanguage research? Let me see how I'm doing. Okay, so I want to talk about descriptive processes and then the decolonial option. And I want to talk about descriptive processes because this is something that I learned when I was young, even before I studied sociolinguistics, from teachers. A very important philosopher of education, Patricia Carini and Cecilia Troll, who taught us as teachers to examine the practice, our practices, through observing, recording, and using descriptive language. What is descriptive language? Descriptive language is just using language without inferences, without judgment, avoiding categories, labels, and assumptions of educational theory or assessment. You will be surprised how difficult it is for researchers to do this. You ask them to describe this, and they start telling you what it's used for, or how could they improve it, instead of saying what it is, right? So it's the discipline of being able to describe and use language without any of these categories that come from our theoretical frameworks, right? So we can really see what's going on instead of imposing this lens, this theoretical lens on everything that we see that doesn't really allow us to see the person. It has to do also with the belief that every human being has the capacity, that the human capacity is widely distributed, that it doesn't belong to a few, that belongs to everybody. And if you've ever done this, like I do, with what I call whole school inquiry, you are amazed. I do this with teachers, principals, and parents. And I am always amazed at what the parents see that I don't see. It really humbles you to understand that this capacity is so widely distributed, right? And attending to the person with care, the person in motion, and for me, that's very important, right? Don't describe something static, but do it with a person in motion. Turn them around, engage as they are in meaningful activity, and attune to the becoming. We're so used to just describing what is and not the becoming. The decolonial option, of course, comes to me from all the decolonial Latin American theorists. Walter Mignolo and Catherine Walsh says that it just seeks to make visible the perspectives that have been displaced by Western rationality, right? And thinking from and with subaltern racial, ethnic, sexual bodies, and an idea that there is a sentipensar meaning feeling and thought, not disconnected as we usually do, but connected in some way, an appreciation for aesthetics also, Maria Lugones tells us. I think I'm gonna skip this because I don't want to delay you, and I want to tell you about the problems that we have. There's tremendous tension in this work. If you're like me, committed to changing how the lives of these children in schools, in dominant schools, whether they're monolingual or bilingual, you know that there's a tension between how the student really makes sense of all and orchestrates all their meaning-making resources and the language policy in schools. And there's this tension that cannot be resolved. I don't think I've worked in schools my whole life. I cannot resolve the language policy that they have. So the idea is, how do you then crack some so that there are some spaces? And that's the work that I did with this big team of people, a team that we like to call La Familia Juntos, together. And if you look at this work, you will see that's a book that we published, again, Together Juntos. And if you look at this work, you will see that it's uneven. I don't figure much in it. Everybody else does, because schools are different. And even in New York City, one school in one block is different from the other one, right? So you have to first look and see, and what is possible in one school is not possible in the other. However, what is possible is to see what it is that children do. This work has taken us in many different ways, and I always say that we made the road by seeing and walking. And I'll tell you what this is about. I thought that the only way to make this change possible, so that it would go beyond the 10 years in which we had funding, was to involve the teacher education faculty. The teacher education faculty who were doing English as a second language, the bilingual education faculty. But they were coming with their vision of what language was in schools, right? So how do you get them then to see what the kids were doing? And we did this again together over a whole semester of doing description, doing what we call this collaborative descriptive inquiries, juntos, so that there's a full description of the student in motion, and so that we are showing our rough edges of work. Because the problem is that when we speak, when we make all these presentations, we do show and tell, right? Everything's perfect, but we know that that's not it, that there's a lot of tension, that there are rough edges of work. So how do we make the rough edges of work visible? And we worked a lot, thank you. We worked a lot with this quote from Patricia Carini in Meditation that says, describing, I pause, and pausing, I attend. It's slow. I have to set aside familiar categories for classifying or generalizing. I have to give it time to speak, to show itself. And I have to shift my own perspective in relation to it. And I have to remember that even though I learn a lot from describing, the world is always larger than my conceptualization of it. And I learned that when I see a lot, I'm still seeing only a little and partially. And I learned that when others join in, the description is always fuller than what I saw alone. And this is where the collaborative aspect of this becomes possible. Once we started seeing, we were able to then think of what needed to happen, right? And we came up with these 3 principles to a translanguaging pedagogical practices. The idea of the stance that comes from describing what people are doing, what children are doing in our case, a design of how to open up a space, and the shifts. I'll talk about the shifts first because the shifts are important. The shifts are basically trying to always follow the student's corriente, right? Knowing that there's a current always in a classroom, right? You may be up here, but you know that the students are somewhere out there, and seeing that the students really need the freedom to act with their translanguaging corriente. And then not policing the language. And I'm not talking about going across languages either. That's not what translanguaging is. We're talking about making sure that students have access to their own unitary repertoire to make their own meaning. So in reading, there are no monolingual texts, because if a student is really engaged with the text, a bilingual student is engaged with the text, that text becomes very dynamic. It becomes bilingual, right? The meaning is from the students up, not from the text down. And it's not for those that were learning a new language. We worked only with what I call emergent bilinguals, that the state calls English language learners. It's not really about adding a separate language, English, but new features that then become one's own. It's like a a string of pearls. You're adding pearls and pearls and pearls to it so that people can extend their repertoire, so that there is no possibility of shifting or whatever. And it's very important for me to say that these are not strategies, but again, it's opening up these spaces for strategic reasons. And we have been able to identify 4, there may be more, but this is what we have done, right? We know that sometimes it's important for scaffolding. We know that if you want to know what Julia knows about fish, you have to make sure that you do it in a language that she understands. Otherwise, you are always seeing her as deficient, because what you're doing is you're not assessing Julia, you're assessing the name language, English, right? We're doing it to deepen understanding. So when we read together, we become, we have more understandings. And we're doing it also to transform the subjectivities of inferiority that we have always somehow assigned to these kids in classrooms, and the critical consciousness of all, and especially the listeners, the mainstream listeners. So just to end then. So why is it that I am now bringing you this issue of how do we translanguage research? I think it's because for too long, the traditions of scholarship and research that we have followed really restrict our vision of how bilinguals do language and have created deficiencies and failure. So, last slide. If the languages are social constructions and deficiency is socially defined, what I tell all of you is that yes, we can as scholars and researchers overturn foundations, making conventional definitions of otherness hard to sustain, as Ansaldúa has told us, and free our imagination from slavery to preconceived notions, and embrace some notion of critical hope. Because there cannot be social justice for racialized bilinguals. And here I want to acknowledge especially the work of Ingrid Pillar and many of us who have worked on social justice. But I want to say that you cannot do so without first cognitive justice. As Boaventura de Sousa Santos, the Brazilian, the Portuguese, the colonial theorist has taught us to say, because cognitive justice starts with questioning the concept of one or more named languages as discrete and complete entities, and research that perpetuates it. Y gracias, and to you, I leave the future.